Talking through the win total overs and unders, some of our leans for the NFC teams, and what the ramifications are for fantasy football. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. Shawn, last week we did the AFC divisions. So anybody listening to our long shows or our shorts, those were more divisionally focused. You definitely know what we're doing here today with the NFC teams because we went through the whole AFC last week. We're going to talk a little bit about the sports betting market, I guess, the win total over unders. Really, it's just an interesting way to discuss how the market is valuing the different teams. First of all, it's where the lines were set, and then also where they were bet. These are really interesting markets in that they get bet fairly heavily one way or the other sometimes, and so you could see where there's optimism for teams to beat the lines that the book set or to not beat, to go under the lines that the book set. A lot of times on the extremes, we see a lot of betting to the over on the really low ones, a lot of betting to the under on the really high ones, because the market does seem to say there's a lot of uncertainty in football, and we know that part of it as well. But it's interesting to look through these and to talk through the market and consider the fantasy football ramifications. Generally speaking, not always, obviously, not for every single type of player, but generally speaking, we want players that are on teams that are winning games and are doing well because they're scoring more points and those types of things. You could talk about it from different positional stuff. Certainly a wide receiver is going to have a little bit more potential to be fine in a bad win-loss situation if it's a team that's willing to throw a ton while they trail. Flip side of that is a running back is probably more dependent on being ahead, especially if they're the type of running back that racks up a lot of rush attempts while they're ahead. And so those situations can be very favorable for them. But broadly, we're just sort of talking through the different teams and the expectations. And so often when we see, like we talk about this on the show all the time, we're looking for outliers. We're looking for breakout players. And that starts at the team level sometimes. So often we see the teams that are the breakout teams be the ones that you wanted to have the key players in fantasy for that season. And you go back, I'm thinking all the way back to when Stephon Diggs first came to the Bills, and Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs was the breakout combo for the Bills pass game. A couple years ago, the Eagles, when they made their Super Bowl run, you wanted to be in on A.J. Brown in his first season in Philly. You wanted to be on Jalen Hurts for his breakout season. When you get the breakout offense right, it can be so valuable. And even not just the offense that is so good that makes a run to the Super Bowl, but sometimes just the one that's better than anticipated. Last year, the Buccaneers, people were writing off for dead, but they were decent, and that was important. The Rams, a lot of people thought after a disaster of a 2022, Matthew Stafford's not going to stay healthy. Cooper Kupp's not going to stay healthy. There's no value here. And suddenly a couple rookies or young players, Kyron Williams, a second-year player, but Puka Nacua, Kyron Williams infuse a jolt of electricity into this offense that is a lot better than the collapse risk that I think a lot of people were worried about with the Rams going into last year. So we can look at expectations right now. We can talk about the teams that we expect to be better, even among good teams, be really good potentially, be the real, true, exciting offenses, breakout offenses of the year. We can also talk about some of the teams on the low end, like we did, on the East. We talked about like the Broncos, for example, a team that very low over under, but we think could, with Bo Nix, at least be a little bit interesting offensively. So we're going to go through the whole NFC, and that's sort of the approach. Or excuse me, NFC. That's the right conference. That's the whole approach. But before we jump in, how are you doing?
Good. And like you mentioned, this isn't betting advice. It's more of a framework. But we did get some fun notes a couple of years ago that our Chiefs-Eagles Super Bowl prediction had covered up all the rest of the mistakes we'd made on that season. So then hopefully we'll make some predictions today that cover up the mistakes, of which there will certainly be plenty. But before we get into all that, I did want to mention that you just launched the YouTube version of Stealing Signals, a couple of really successful shows. Very excited about that. The feedback has been fantastic. Your graphics are insane. Everything about it is so cool. You've already got a lot of subscribers. I would love for anybody who subscribes to any of our stuff for you just to pause it real quick, go over, subscribe to that. We'd love to get Ben over 1,000 just, in the next handful of days. That would be a really cool thing to do real quickly here, but we're going to jump back in. And Ben, where are we starting today?
We're going to start in the NFC North. And I appreciate those kind words. It was a fun launch. So turn the notifications on. I'm going to be going live, making some slow draft Underdog picks because I'm in a bunch of slow drafts right now. So it might happen at weird times. You get a ping and it'll be, hey, Ben's going live, and you can come jump and hang out with me. But we're going to start at the NFC North. Last show when we did the AFC, started in the AFC South, and we talked about how that's a division that is on the up and up, right? It's a division that was down for a couple of years, but with CJ Stroud, with Anthony Richardson and Steichen, with the potential for the Jags to bounce back, even with Brian Callahan taking over the Titans, we kind of glossed over the Titans. I got a little feedback on that we weren't maybe fair enough to the Titans as a potentially fun team as well. But that looks like a great division, and we're gonna do the same thing here in the NFC.
Still have Will Levis at quarterback?
Yeah, they do. So okay. That's why, Sean, I talked about the coach. All right.
All right.
On the NFC side, I feel like people didn't watch him after that 4 TD game in his first start, but it wasn't very good after that 4 TD game in his first start. On the NFC side, the comparable division that's kind of on the up and up is the NFC North. The last few years, you go back before the Lions breakout last year, and it was kind of between the Packers and between the Vikings a little bit. As we head into 2024, you look at like the divisional betting odds, the Lions having won the division last year and made it all the way to the NFC Championship game and been in position to potentially go to the Super Bowl, but not being able to get there. They're the fairly decent favorite to win the division, not huge favorite. The Packers not far behind them. And then in third in odds to win the division, the Lions are at plus 150 to win the division. The Packers are at plus 210 over on DraftKings, and the Bears are at plus 265. So not much further behind. And that's the Bears, who bring in Caleb Williams into this really interesting situation for a rookie number 1 overall pick. The big discussion all offseason is basically no number 1 overall pick has ever come into a situation this good, right? You have DJ Moore, you have Keenan Allen, you have Rome Odunze, another top 10 pick with you. You have Cole Kmet, you have signed DeAndre Swift, and you already had multiple, interesting running backs. They've done some work on the offensive line. This offense could be really interesting for the Bears, and they had a decent defense down the stretch last year as well. The team that's actually the also ran, I mentioned those 3 betting numbers for the divisional odds. The Vikings are at plus 1,000. You get them at 10-1. Everyone else better than 3-1 odds. Vikings 10-1 to win the division. I do think that's being missed a little bit by the market by our fantasy football player markets, that the Vikings are being predicted to be in a reload year. They let some defensive pieces go. They might still have an interesting offense, and there might still be some tempo as they play from behind, if they do play from behind. But they are maybe one of the places to start, kind of an interesting one for me. Their over-under was set at 6.5. They're being bet pretty heavily to the over already. I do think it's kind of interesting as it relates to like an Aaron Jones, who I've started to take a little bit in best ball. I can see the case for some spike weeks. He's still a really electric player. He's going to be playing in a dome. He's going to, maybe you can't really rely on him being super healthy in best ball, but you probably get some spike weeks. That's probably where I want to get my exposure to him, because as an older back, I don't know that I really want him in seasonal. And my bigger concern is, are those spike weeks going to be able to come? Or is this offense going to need a year? Is it going to be a lot of J.J. McCarthy? Is that a problem for Justin Jefferson and for Jordan Addison's year 2 breakout? We know TJ Hawkinson is going to be rehabbing in the early part of the year, and his ADP is pushed down right now as a result. That's an offense that has some really fun pieces. But when you look at this market, you look at the win totals and the long shot element, I think maybe we're overplaying what they'll actually be, whether they'll actually score enough touchdowns and be interesting enough for fantasy.
They are interesting, but I do still like the over. I think that these 2 teams, in terms of the young potential breakout teams, the Vikings and the Bears, are arguably closer in terms of what their outlook is for the upcoming season than what the odds would indicate. And I do think a lot of what we're seeing is that despite the trendiness of JJ McCarthy in a variety of forums, there's certainly a lot more skepticism about his ability to go out there and instantly lead the Vikings to the type of season that people are expecting now from Caleb Williams with what he's surrounded by. I guess I don't think that there's that big a gap between what these two teams have, because we've made the argument that, I mean, one of the reasons, or I've made the argument that one of the reasons I have Odunze ranked where he is that, I mean, Keenan Allen and DJ Moore are very, very good players, but neither one of them is anywhere close to a Justin Jefferson. And then I've consistently compared Jordan Addison to Calvin Ridley under Julio Jones as he broke into the league. And I think at this point, it's kind of covered up just how good Jordan Addison is as the number 2. I think that they're back in Jones is better, certainly, than DeAndre Swift. I think that the dome allows that offense to potentially be more dynamic and more aggressive than what you get with Soldier Field, especially once TJ Hawkinson does come back. If in fact we do get that for the second half of the season, this is going to be an absolutely loaded team. So I think you're kind of selling JJ McCarthy at this price, and partly because I think that below the most obvious surface of looking at how dynamic these offenses could be, the Vikings are probably going to make a jump on defense, right? You look at them last season, you pull up the SIS numbers in the Advanced Team Explorer, and you see that they rank 25 or worse in both passing defense war and pass rush war. This is a team that defensively was not particularly good, which is one of the reasons that they needed to score a lot with those weapons that they had the last couple of years. Well, in addition to that, they then do lose Danielle Hunter, but they go out and they make multiple significant acquisitions on defense with Jonathan Greenard, Blake Cashman, and Andrew Van Ginkel. But then the other thing is that they had a second first-round pick, Ben, and they use that pick to select a defensive end. And you put all of those pieces together, and I think that the Vikings could be one of these teams that start to make the type of defensive jump that we have witnessed with the Kansas City Chiefs, where they took their team, even with a Patrick Mahomes, you lose a Tyreek Hill. And it didn't happen overnight, but slowly but surely, they're able to build out that defensive orientation to the squad. That doesn't mean they're going to be an elite defense, but if you can jump from that bottom 10 into the middle of the pack, that allows you to be, I wouldn't say more conservative, but it probably sets up a better environment for what might be Sam Darnold early on. And if that's the case, then I'm definitely fine with whatever the line is here, because if you're the Vikings, you've got to get McCarthy out there early, and you got to start to pretty much immediately demonstrate these supposed traits that he has. One of the things that I ran across when I put out all of the prospect-based evaluations of, well, when I looked at the QB prospects, was that his numbers didn't really pop for me, even knowing kind of the situation. I think that it's kind of overstated maybe what he did as a game manager. And yet, if you're going to draft him where they did, it's similar to, the Denver Broncos situation with Bo Nix, even though one guy's old, one guy's young, it's still a thing where you bought in. Maybe there are some concerns about the fact that they very clearly wanted a different quarterback in this draft. And that's a tough way to start out the career of a guy you just used your first round pick on. But for me, the Vikings are an interesting place where we know that they have weapons on offense and they might be a little bit better defensively. Certainly, it's a team, and I like this coaching staff. A couple of years ago, they won all the close games. If you told me that they had some close game luck in 2024 and actually challenged the Lions and Packers, that actually wouldn't surprise me that much.
I like that. That's a little bit of a spicy take. I came in wanting to tell everyone that the Vikings line says that they're going to be bad this year. Some good points on their defensive acquisitions. I guess I didn't really put together how much they added on that side of the ball. Just was thinking about how they had lost Danielle Hunter in addition to already struggling last year. But But yeah, a lot of firepower on the offensive side. Does that mean where are you at on Aaron Jones? Does that mean you're kind of into Aaron Jones?
I am. I have him in a range that he's not going to be a priority pick, but he's not going to be a clear fade, which most older running backs, I mean,
Yeah.
you and I are going to have them ranked in a spot where you would just never end up with them on your team. And the contrast for me between him and, say, a Josh Jacobs, who is the trendier name with the Packers and a potential guy who could be a star in his new surroundings, I kind of prefer Aaron Jones.
Yeah, got a little bit more efficiency to lock into. The thing about Jacobs that's a mildly concerning is that the big 2022 season didn't really line up with what he had done prior, right? We know that the efficiency kind of came out of nowhere. In addition to a really strong workload, he was such a key fantasy pick that year. It didn't carry over to 2023. He actually had his worst, yards per carry of his career, and very much lower yards per target, and on the receiving side, lowest catch rate of his career. Doesn't mean he's going to be bad. The Packers were willing to spend some money to bring him in, but I think you have to look at that 2022 season right now as an outlier in a lot of ways in his career in terms of the efficiency. You look at Aaron Jones, you get the efficiency most years, right? I mean, he's been a guy who's been explosive whenever he has the ball in his hands. Let's go to the Packers, because the Packers are another one where the way that the market is leaning, I like. You mentioned the first one, the Vikings. You do like the over, the way that it's been bet a little bit. The Packers opened at an over-under of 10.5. We mentioned on the AFC show the highest teams are at 11.5. So it's perhaps no surprise that them getting that kind of respect led to quite a bit of bets on the under. They're at minus 155 to the under right now. It's not a bet that I necessarily love, but I do think it's interesting. I think there's a lot of people that are in on the Packers that are excited about the Packers. I think Matt LaFleur's a really, really good coach, but the way that I've kind of thought about this is that I feel like what he did scheme-wise was able to elevate their pass game and create sort of a high floor. And we see that with good schemers, I think, sometimes, where it can create efficient plays. It can create good opportunities in good matchups when the scheme is right, when the play calling is right for the right defense. It can create easy throws and create opportunities for efficient plays that then elevate the pass numbers. What I'm getting at is I think the market really, and when I say the market now, I'm talking about the fantasy football market, is really buying into Jordan Love's late season production. It was strong. You look at it, and it was very good. And what he went and did in Dallas in the first postseason game, they put their foot on the gas against Dallas and never let up. I mean, they could have they got an early lead. They could have potentially been caught from behind, but they gave up some points eventually, I think, in that game. The way that I recall that game is the Packers were just continuing to score. Dallas never got close because the Packers refused to do anything but put points on the board. And so you add in a playoff game. Yeah, the final was 48-32 in that game. They ended up giving up 32 points. Didn't matter. They still win by 16 points. You win a playoff game like that, you go into San Francisco and you almost win another road playoff game. You lose by 3 to the Niners in a game that the Packers very much could have won. But you saw some of the issues in the second half of that Niners game, or at least some of the issues that I would say are not solved for me on Jordan Love yet. I do still think the Packers could be a good offense, but I think there's a lot of optimism about them. And I wonder if 2023 was sort of the elevation through scheme that I was just discussing, and whether they're going to have the ability to take that next step as defenses start to account for some of the scheme related things. I think I've made this comparison before, Sean, but it feels to me at least a little bit like, and not the exact same situation, but some of the stuff that Sean McVay ran into early with the Rams. And this ended up not even being, a death knell for Jared Goff. And I'm not trying to make it a death knell for Jordan Love, but the Jared Goff stuff, the Rams offense, very, very efficient at first because some of the things they were doing, teams didn't have answers for. And then the next year, they start to have some answers. They start to have some things they want to throw at the quarterback to kind of challenge him a little bit more. Once the defenses start to prepare better for what Jordan Love is and understand what his game is and how they've been beat and the stuff they've put on film, It's a little bit like a hitter in baseball comes up and gets hot early, and then pitchers start to throw off speed pitches or try to find a hole in their swing or something. You're going to have a different approach eventually from the other side. Do you then have answers for that next approach? I make the Rams comparison because it seemed like Sean McVay and Jared Goff didn't have those answers. They didn't feel like they had those answers. The Rams ultimately trade Goff, and a lot was made about the fact that they did so because they felt like they couldn't evolve their offense far enough with that quarterback, and then they were able to with Matthew Stafford to go on and win a title. Interestingly enough, Jared Goff just got a massive contract because he's been a wild success for the Lions. That's where I'm at with the Packers, though, Sean, is I have concern that at least relative to what I think is there in the market and what I'm hearing feels like a lot of certainty that Jordan Love is it. And I'm not saying that he's not, because he was real like down the stretch, Sean, in his last 8 regular season games, 18 touchdowns, 1 interception. It's a good stretch to help them get into the playoffs. They went 6-2 in that stretch. And then in the playoffs, he throws 3 touchdowns and no interceptions against Dallas. He did have 2 picks against San Francisco, but 2 more TDs in that game. I mean, like, very strong, very efficient. The yardage numbers weren't super high. Some of these games, the pass attempt totals aren't super high. It's like they're playing off of, something like an efficient run game and throwing. I mean, that Dallas game, they scored 48 points. He actually went 16 for 21 in that game. Super efficient, but only 21 pass attempts. It's not, a young Patrick Mahomes where it was like, oh, we're going to go throw for 5,000 yards and 50 touchdowns because your skill level is unlimited. Like, we can just throw every single down. That's the concern, I guess. I kind of just want to know how you feel about that. Am I overstating that? Because I am feeling like I'm a little bit light on my Packers exposure right now.
The Packers are a tricky team to play, although I do have Jaden Reed in a range that makes him, a borderline priority target, somebody I'm going to get a decent amount of. But the thing that's so interesting about the Packers is I think that the way that you framed it, where we can be uncertain what they're going to be like, extends to so many different parts of that team. Because on the one hand, you have the potential for Reed and Christian Watson and Luke Musgrave, and then these running backs to be stars. And if the QB is even a borderline star on top of that, this offense should be pretty unstoppable with the coaching staff that you just mentioned. On the other hand, we really don't know what Reed is yet. We certainly don't know what Watson is, even though he's been there for a while. We don't know if he's going to be able to stay healthy. He's done some things in the offseason to work really hard on figuring out the soft tissue injuries. That I'm impressed by. I think that's great work. You hope it comes to fruition for him, or that it works, because anytime that someone does go to that effort, you're rooting for them. But we don't know if he's going to be healthy. We know that some of these other players have also flashed, like a Dontavian Wicks. We know that Romeo Doubs is occasionally impressive. But so the redundancy that they have too, because Tucker Kraft was fantastic as a backup to Musgrave, means that they can sustain injuries and work through it a lot better than a lot of teams. I think that gives them a great floor. I think the coaching staff gives them a great floor. There's also this kind of interesting difference between Love and some of the other QBs in these sort of Shanahan-esque offenses, where you mentioned how McVay gets rid of Goff because he can't take the next step. Goff's somebody who, when he's allowed to throw the types of passes that he throws well, he really thrives when he has that talent around him. That's one of the things that he's got going there, obviously, in Detroit, but probably not a playmaker. And yet what he does bring is enough that they did sign him that huge contract, like you mentioned. You have a similar kind of thing with Tua, where not a lot of mobility, not a lot of playmaking, but when the guys are there and the offense is there, he can execute it. Love is a very different type of QB, where the accuracy, especially when you watch the games, is pretty limited. And this was one of the things that was a problem for him in his little lone chances to play some in the past, which led to people thinking that he was a bust. And especially when you don't have all of that, then the decision-making is going to also be questionable. And so you look bad. Well, the decision-making has improved a lot of these guys are wide open, but he has the mobility and he has the arm to do a lot of things that those other guys can't. So you get the counterbalancing kind of effect. And I think it's a great fit with what they want to do. So I guess I have a lot of enthusiasm about that, both their floor and then their ceiling. If you were to tell me that they don't hit their ceiling for the reasons you mentioned, that would not surprise me in the least. One of the things that's also interesting, though, beyond these sort of higher profile, offensive skill position players, is just they actually have a lot of turnover on this team. Where when you go through and you look and you can use Spot Track, they did a great job. There are some other good sites out there as well. But even if you don't know every single thing about some of the players that you're not following for offense, when you have players who are peak ages who get big contracts elsewhere, so you're losing guys who were, again, in that peak age category, and you're losing multiple players, then you're going to have to fill some of those holes. So they lose a couple of guys, and where they spend is on Josh Jacobs. We know that's a very questionable way to turn around your resources if you're losing peak players at a different position. But the flip side of that, they do add a couple of defensive backs, and that's something that could help them. Their pass defense is another one that ranked in the bottom 10 in WAR last season. But this is a team that also had 5 picks in the first 3 rounds. And although, they do use one of those on running backs, they spent a lot on running back in the offseason. They have 4 additional picks, and because they had the rest of the offense pretty well built out, those 4 picks can go to the non-sexy positions, and you kind of lose track of them a little bit. I think it'll be interesting to see how this team that is young kind of rises up and develops in terms of the full roster. Do they end up getting built out as a power team where, 6 months from now, we're saying, this is a team like we tend to think about the Ravens or the 49ers, where just the overall power of their team is a lot to deal with, that they have depth, that they have firepower, they have got a good coaching staff, they've got a functional QB. If things hit for them, they're going to be very tough for the Detroit Lions, which, part of it is just, homer bias, but I think the Lions set up to be a very fun team this season.
They do. And I already took them to win the division over at Stealing Lines. They're a really fun one to talk about. We'll definitely get to. I think that's a great point about the Packers. They used 3 of their first 4 picks defensively. Their first round pick was an offensive lineman. So it's what you said, sort of the less sexy positions, but they're building out things. They had 2 second rounders. They had 2 third rounders in addition to that first rounder. I think you said that really well. It's a tricky one to get pinned down. One of the really unique things about them last year was how young the receiving core was. Talked a little bit about this at the time, but they went into training camp with their 90-man roster with 11 wide receivers on the board and on the roster. They ended up cutting that down. All 11 of them were either 2022 or 2023 class players. They were either rookies or second-year pros. They did not have a single wide receiver, even in camp, that was a more than a 2-year NFL veteran. That made the Romeo Dobbs and the Christian Watsons of the world the elder statesmen, basically. And so we saw some of that throughout the season. They rotated. I've heard people reference their rotations at wide receiver. I think that's a very logical way that they were playing things to figure out what they had. I think they were going into last year we're going to take this almost like a dynasty manager, what things that we do in fantasy, where we're going to get a lot of stuff. We're rebuilding. We're going to get a lot of young players. We're going to see what hits, and then we're going to figure out from there. And they had some fun hits. One of the guys that I really like is Dontavian Wicks. You get a really nice price on him. There's scenarios where he's not even really playing in 3 wide receiver sets. It's only Dobbs, Reed, and Christian Watson. And then there's scenarios where he's a rotational enough, and a lot of the stuff he did really well. You look at his per route stuff in year 1, very strong. He's building on that. Maybe he displaces Dobbs, who hasn't been particularly strong in his 2 years in the per route stuff. Although in Dobbs' defense, strong postseason last year, had a really good game in that Cowboys game. And so it's a fascinating conversation. They're still developing. They still have a lot of young talent. You mentioned they add more picks this year. If Love is the guy that a lot of people think he is, and I'm definitely open to that, this is going to be a really competitive team. And I like the way you put it with the floor and ceiling potential. The floor feels strong because I do think Matt LaFleur is a really good coach. And that's just going to help regardless. Even if Love gets exposed a little bit, like I was kind of implying. I mean, I have this nagging concern about. I'm not trying to say I'm out on the Packers. It's just like a small concern I have, having watched them all last year. You talked about it. When you really watch him, he's not like, it's just different than like the CJ Stroud breakout. The CJ Stroud breakout, I'm like, there's nothing this guy can't do. And I think he's going to be in the Hall of Fame. The Jordan Love breakout was like, this guy's really, really good. They're doing a lot of stuff really interestingly and a lot and really well. But I still, I guess I'm not quite sure about some of these throws and some of these, some of these things that come to pass. So that's just something I want to mention while we're kind of looking through these types of things. Two more teams we haven't even talked about in the NFC North yet. Maybe the two most interesting ones. We have the Bears, and you mentioned to me that you kind of like their under. They are at an 8.5 over under that's being bet pretty heavily to the over. They got a lot of talent on the offensive side, an interesting defense. You can take the under at plus 140. I'm not suggesting that that's what you said that our listeners should go do, but it is anytime, you're kind of leaning towards the side that gives you plus 140 odds is at least somewhat interesting to think about. You also mentioned the Lions. The short story with them is they got everybody signed this offseason. They got Goff signed. They got Penei Sewell signed. They got Amon-Ra St. Brown signed. Maybe they get more out of Jameson Williams, as he did do decently well after the suspension. The vibes on Williams, that was the conversation last summer, were horrible. He comes back after the suspension. He does some stuff on the field that's actually pretty interesting. He has some aggressive blocking on downfield runs, on some breakaway runs, some downfield blocks that were good to see from a player that effort had been questioned. Somebody that the team has talked about, hey, maybe we'll get on the field a little bit more in 2024. I haven't been taking a ton of him, but he's just a wild card. He's like an upside play that they have in addition to the Sam Laporta breakout and the Amon-Ra St. Brown and the Jahmyr Gibbs breakout. And David Montgomery was a nice fit off of Gibbs. You have so many pieces offensively. The Lions look like they are well positioned to keep making a run. They have a lot of rookie talent, a lot of rookie hits, even though they're paying their quarterback a ton of money now. They just signed all these extensions, and usually you backload them a little bit. The first year cap hit isn't massive. They're going to probably run into some problems when they have to sign everybody that are on these rookie deals and extend them, 2-3 years down the road, because they don't have a rookie quarterback. They're paying Jared Goff a ton of money, and he's probably not a guy that at that contract elevates your win total a ton still, even though he's been really successful for them. But right now, they don't have those issues. Williams and Gibbs and some of the key defensive picks, Brian Branch and the linebacker whose name I'm forgetting. I mean, these guys are all on rookie deals still. So there is a lot for them to continue to look positively toward in the short term. So the Lions, a team that I mentioned liking and betting to win the division, even though there is a competitive division here, they're over under at 10.5 as well, but has been bet to the over a little bit compared to the Packers opening at 10.5 being bet pretty heavily to the under. But Shawn, what do you think about the Bears, who opened it at 8.5? The market really likes them to go over, likes them to be this at least 9-8 team, this above 500 team. We're talking about this as a good competitive division. We know that Caleb Williams is stepping into a situation with a ton of talent, but he's also a rookie quarterback. Even with a good defense, it's a lot to ask, I think, to be betting heavily that they're going to be above 500 in this division.
Yeah, they lose Justin Jones in free agency. They are in a situation where they have those 2 high-profile picks, but they only have 5 picks total, right? So mostly what you're getting here is an injection from Caleb Williams and Odunze. Now that's huge, right? You can't understate that. We want to be aware that there isn't necessarily a ton else that is being added into this particular team. So it really does in many ways fall on those players. And you even looked at free agency, and I mean, the names they've added are DeAndre Swift and Gerald Everett, right? I mean, Gerald Everett doesn't move the needle for anybody. DeAndre Swift, sadly, I'm concerned that he's an overrated player at this juncture in his career, and maybe the 3rd best back on that team. Now, this isn't to say I'm selling the Chicago Bears by any stretch. But I do think we have to be aware of where they were last season, which was a team that was coming on behind the defense, as you mentioned, and better play from Justin Fields in the second half of the season. And yet because of some of the narratives around Fields, I think there's this assumption that a rookie QB who has, some of these potentially transcendent qualities is going to instantly lift them well above what they were getting. I guess I don't know that that's fair to him, right? I mean, he's being set up not just to fail in the same way that Bryce Young failed, because there are weapons around him, but the expectations may be a little out of line with what he accomplished last year at USC, for example. And so I think we want to be aware of that within this division, where it has easily the highest average number of expected wins of any division in the NFC, right? So you've got both the Lions and the Packers to deal with there. You're going across against the NFC West, which obviously has the 49ers and the Rams. You've got rising teams potentially in the Seahawks and the Cardinals. We talked last week about how the AFC South, their other division they hit, is a potentially rising division. I guess I have mild concerns that the Bears are still a year away, and that maybe, unlike some of these other teams, the coaching staff is a real question mark, and not necessarily in a good way, where you think about the Lions and the Packers as potentially elite coaching staffs. You look at the Vikings, probably an underrated coaching staff. You look at the Chicago Bears, those coaches have a lot to prove.
That's a really good point. It's one of those ones that, I mean, even as somebody who I think about that kind of stuff more than the average person, I hadn't really thought through either, but that's a great point. I think if you're ranking the coaching staffs in the NFC North, you have to be putting them last by a decent margin. I think Kevin O'Connell's a pretty good coach. I mean, I think you're right. The Vikings probably are a little bit of an underrated coaching staff. They were able to outpace their point differential a couple of years ago and win all those close games late, which is the kind of thing that people have used to justify, not justify, but we talked about the Mike Tomlin thing, the AFC show. And that's a big thing that people have pointed to with Mike Tomlin is win-loss totals consistently outperform his point differentials. And he's able to consistently beat those types of metrics. I mean, Kevin O'Connell did that very well in 2022. They fell back in 2023. They have their starting quarterback tears his Achilles, and they have, Justin Jefferson is hurt for most of the season, and obviously not a strong season in terms of,
and they were still pretty decent,
and they were still actually competitive. Yeah. I mean, it's a pretty good note there. And it is interesting that the Bears are still going forward with Eberflus. Maybe he'll be the right guy, but if you asked me what's going to happen, I've kind of thought through like, oh yeah, he'll be the early, for Caleb Williams, he'll be the early career coach that gets, replaced. And then Caleb Williams takes the next step. I mean, that happens with a lot of young quarterbacks, a lot of young athletes, I mean, that's like the Michael Jordan story, right? Phil Jackson eventually took over, and then they took off. Yeah. So the NFC North, fun division. Shawn, any other thoughts on the division at large?
Well, the Lions scored a lot of points. They gave up a decent number of points. They lose a couple of players in free agency, but they add a corner. They use their first 2 picks in the NFL draft on corners. They ranked number 20th last year in pass defense WAR. They're up at 11 in pass rush, and they had good pressure percentage numbers there. There's a potential for this defense to take a little bit of a step forward. As a fantasy manager, I'm kind of hoping they don't, right? Because they already are splitting the pie so many different ways that you want them to be involved in shootouts. There's a potential for the Detroit Lions to be a power team. They look like the best team in the NFC at the end of last year. That probably doesn't do full credit to what the Cowboys and 49ers accomplished over the whole season, or how the 49ers, did rally to win the NFC Championship game. But that was a game where, the coaching staff probably did, I wouldn't say missed on the game management exactly, but certainly their decisions went against them in a way where if those decisions pan out, they're in the Super Bowl, maybe they're the Super Bowl champions. They have the 2-point conversion at the end of the season against the Dallas Cowboys that was very controversial. If you told me that they take another step and that a year from now we're discussing them as the clear best team in the NFC, that would not surprise me at all.
That brings me to a point that I don't know if I've floated to you before. Maybe I've said it on Ship Chasing. I've definitely spitballed this idea, but I want to ask you about it while we're still here on Laporta and just this group of elite tight ends. There's a top 7 tight ends I've taken to saying that I think is stronger in their draft profiles than we've ever had in fantasy. You're somebody that I would actually want your thoughts on that, because I mean, you like me have played for a really long time, and that's not meant to be hyperbole. I don't think we've ever had 7 tight ends deep this good. Do you agree with that?
I do.
I mean,
and it's certainly a reason why. No, I think that I wouldn't say have to get, but you want to make sure that a decent number of your teams, especially when you're drafting in the FFPC, are built with the 2 tight ends, because the flip side of that is that when you have a large number of stars, I mean, argue even it's somewhat artificial, because the other tiers are still very questionable.
Yeah.
Right. But when you have that, however you want to phrase it, but the artificially less scarce tier 1, then you end up with decent prices too. And so the combination of those 2 things, I think, requires you to be aggressive at that position.
Well, I just said, yeah, really aggressively, because I thought you were going to say the other tiers were strong, actually. But the late, I get your point, is the late rounds, there's not a lot there. But I do think the group right outside the top 7 is also, like, we've talked about, like David Njoku. We talked about the tight ends recently. There's some, Brock Bowers is not a part of this top 7. He's one of the best rookies prospects at tight end of all time.
Well, I have him in my top 7, so I'm going
to. Yeah, right. I know you're very excited about some of those guys as well. So, I mean, there's all, like, I was thinking about that just today, though, as even outside that elite top 7, the 8, 9, 10, 11-ish is stronger than the second tier most years, when there's only a top tier of 4 or 5, and that next tier is like 6, 7, 8. I would take this year's like 8, 9, 10 over, I don't know, some random insert year 2021's 6, 7, 8 tight end 6, 7, 8, whatever it is. Anyway, it's an interest, but I still think that top 7 is a really intriguing one. The case that I wanted to make, and the question I wanted to ask you, and you just said you have Brock Bowers in your top 7, so maybe you don't even have George Kittle in your top 7, but George Kittle is still a super dynamic, elite efficiency player, but is pushed way down in ADP because there's only one ball in San Francisco, and everything you just said that could happen with the Lions, in terms of there's a lot of guys to catch passes, and the Lions still have Amon-Ra St. Brown, and they still have Jahmyr Gibbs. They're still going to do a lot of stuff with their running backs. They don't have both Ayuk and Debo like the Niners do, but the kind of take that I've been floating that I don't know if I had mentioned to you before is it feels to me like Kittle is just like a discount Laporta. Like their profiles are incredibly similar. Kittle's getting docked, even though we know the talent is good. We know he has the elite spike week potential. He's still a strong bet in like a best ball, like what you're trying to get out of an elite tight end. You're trying to get that spike week, like playoff upside and obviously full season scoring. He's still a good bet in those regards. There's just concern about whether he can get enough volume and be consistent enough throughout the whole season, which I'd argue is a little bit overplayed. Like Brandon Ayuk's going in the second round. He had 105 targets last year in his massive breakout season. And I don't know where you're going to tell me that he's going to go up in efficiency. Is he going to add 30 targets from that? Like I love Brandon Ayuk, but people have asked me why he's not going at the 1-2 turn. And I'm like, because you can't project him for very much more volume than he already had last year. But
the thing you want to keep in mind with the 49ers receivers is they're the same guys that they have been or are going to be. And when they're cheap, you buy them. And when they're not, you be pretty careful, right? And if there's a different guy like George Kittle, I mean, the thing with Kittle, there has been, and as he gets older, I think that we have some concerns about his ability to stay healthy. And I do think that there are a lot of formats where some weekly floor does help you. Now, when you're talking about how are you going to win a tournament, the huge spike weeks are going to be a big part of that. But the total points are also going to help you when you think about how are you going to advance teams, certainly how you win the FFPC main event, those types of things. But exactly. And if they do make a trade and move Debo, I don't think it actually moves the needle that much for Brandon Ayuk, but it does for George Kittle.
It makes Kittle like an identical play to Laporta in my mind. I mean, I think Laporta's fantastic, but I also think Kittle's fantastic. I mean, and now Kittle's older. There's some injury concerns. I
Well,
guess
then
maybe it's
Laporta went out in the playoff game after having taken a brutal hit to close out the season and like acted like it didn't matter, which we don't want to put too much emphasis on people playing hurt. It's not even necessarily something we're trying to encourage, but there have been some, fairly high profile situations in the last couple of years where people didn't want to play even in the playoffs with injuries. He went out and looked awfully, awfully good. I mean, for me, Sam Laporta and Trey McBride are gapped from the rest of the tight end field.
I feel the same way. Those two guys look really incredible and have spoken favorably about them. This is more about Kittle than about knocking Laporta. But you look at Laporta's like season last year, very, very strong season, but only had 5 games with more than 5 receptions. It's not like he caught 86 balls. It's really good for a tight end, but and then he actually had 2 9-catch games in the playoffs, which you just kind of alluded to, a strong playoff run. But it's not like he was out there catching 110 plus balls, in his rookie year. And maybe he can get there, but I just, that's the that's the only real reason I can see why Kittle is going as late as he is. But I guess the other part of it is there's 6 other really good tight ends in front of him. And so he falls to tight end 7. It's an interesting conversation. I'm not trying to knock Laporta, who I've enjoyed drafting where he's priced. I think Kittle's he seems to be getting knocked for these teammate issues and market share issues. There's only one ball to go around. You just talked about the Lions potentially being so good that there's not enough, opportunity, pass opportunity to go around. It is different. It's not the exact same situation. Laporta is kind of the 1-2 guy with Amon-Ra St. Brown, as opposed to Kittle being the third in San Francisco. So I don't want to harp on that point too much.